Arne Duncan. There you go. Perfect. I never know when this is going to fail. For people who are coming onto this for the very first time, I've known Secretary Duncan for about 10 years now. I did not know him until he was Barack Obama's Secretary of Education. But over the entire term of the Obama administration, Arne, I probably saw you more than any other cabinet person. Your doors were always open, and I have always been a fan, a believer in you, because of the courage that it often took to challenge the education status quo. And I have had a habit in these calls of acknowledging a mistake that I made at the beginning of them, because I'm so angry at reporters who try to come across as being really smart, and I'm an idiot. If you remember, this was about the third or fourth presentation I've made to you, and I've got it on my laptop, which is similar to the one I have right now, and we could not make it work. We're in the Department of Education. I'm actually presenting to you on the importance of technology in education, and I cannot connect my computer to your screen, and neither could your team. So I just thought it'd be an interesting thing for me to begin that way. And we're going to hit COVID here. We're going to hit the protests here. And I know I'm going to agitate people with the very first question. Please explain to me why a child in Mississippi and a child in Massachusetts do not have the same standard. They both live in the same country. They're going to have the same challenges. But what is so wrong about asking a child from North Carolina to be able to do just as well as a child from Oregon?
Well, you start with a question I can't answer because it's inexplicable, and it makes no sense whatsoever for children, for our country, for our country's economy. And, we can sort of talk about the different battles or things we worked on, but one of the things, there's so much in education that is set up to be opaque, to be not transparent, to make it hard to understand what's going on. And one of the many things we tried to challenge when we went to DC was this idea of 50 different state standards, every state having a different set of standards. And I always say, if you follow a football team or a basketball team, there's only one way of keeping score, and everybody sees it in the paper. If you're invested in a public company, there's one way of measuring a stock price. But somehow in education, we think it's okay to have 50 different standards. And the idea that somehow the standards in Illinois versus, Indiana, which is, 30 minutes from where I live here, versus Wisconsin, to your point, Mississippi, Massachusetts, not only is it not good, it's actually a horrific idea, because in so many places, due to political pressure, those standards get reduced, they get dummied down. So children are told they're on track to be successful when in fact they're not. It's one of the most insidious things we do in education. And so having just a set of high standards, and for me, that simply means college and career ready standards. We can get into the technical side of this if we want, is where we have to go as a country, and we haven't had the political will. This idea of local control is so baked into this. And I'll tell, you told one story on yourself, and I remember that like yesterday. It's funny. I'll tell you one story that's less funny on our side. All this stuff is really personal. When I was running the Chicago Public Schools, our test scores were getting better every year. We were celebrating that. Things were feeling good. And we had an outside group, the Chicago Consortium on School Research, that was objective, third party. It's a real blessing. You didn't always like what they told you, but you needed to hear it. And they actually looked at how our students were doing. And because Illinois was one of the states that had reduced their standards, children who were quote unquote proficient were going to go on average, we're going to go on and get a 16 on the ACT. And about 10% of kids who get a 16 on the ACT graduate. So they presented to us. We had no clue. It was one of the biggest punch in the guts I'll ever remember. Basically, we had become part of the problem because we were happily telling parents and kids, you're on track, you're doing well. When they did the correlation, basically only those students that were advanced on the state tests were on track to get a 20 on the ACT, which puts you on track to being more successful in college. And so we just stopped paying any attention to the quote unquote proficiency thing, just tried to get our kids into that advanced category. We had a long way to go, but we lie so often in education to protect adults, to protect political interests. And it does, again, the big picture for our kids, for our country, it does us all a grave disservice.
Is that why we're so hostile, and particularly on the Republican side? But it works across teachers' unions. Nobody wants testing anymore. It's now become a dirty word, and I don't get it. How are you going to hold people accountable, parents, students, teachers, administrators, without some sort of exam?
Yeah, it's complicated, and I think there's a balance. There are many who thought I was just wanted testing all the time. That's not at all who I've ever been. I do think we should assess students annually. I do think we should have a common assessment across districts, across states, so that we understand who's making progress and who's not. I always want to look at how are gifted students doing? Are they improving, or are we just sort of coasting on that? How are special needs students doing? How are English language learners? You got to look at it by subcategory and see who's making progress and who isn't. I also think now we'll get into it with COVID and this new reality that we're entering. Just what we're assessing, how we we should be questioning everything. Why is our school year based upon the agrarian economy? Not too many of our kids are working in the fields in the summer anymore. Maybe we should be working through the school year and taking time off during flu season, as people are starting to do now, as we get into November, December, January. The other thing, Frank, for me is we've always measured what I call seat time, how long you sit in a chair. We don't measure competency, which is what you know. So the easy example is something like Algebra 1. You should pass Algebra 1 when you know algebra. That might be after 3 months. That might be after 9 months. Maybe it's after 12 months, and that's okay, and we need some extra help. But how we think, not just about annual assessments, but real-time assessments and how students are moving. Students that can move faster, let's help them. Students that need more help, let's help them as well in a very different way. But now is the perfect time that's forcing us to all the conventional things we've done for 50 years, 100 years. It's a new world now, and we have to think much more creatively than we are here in the United States.
So I'm going to give you the keys to the schoolhouse, and I'm going to give you a chance for one day, right now, to wave a magic wand. If you could make 3 specific changes to education on the K-12, what would you make? What would you do?
I'll give you 20. Let me try and prioritize. The first thing is that for me, the hope and the dream of public education, my passion, is that theoretically it should be the great equalizer, that a child, doesn't matter zip code or race or socioeconomic status, if they work hard, they should be able to be successful, and the public school system should be able to move them into the middle class, into upper mobility. Because we go back to this local control, because we are so focused on local control in our country, and so much of the funding for public education comes from local property taxpayers, by definition, almost everywhere in the country, not everywhere, but almost everywhere, the children of the wealthy get dramatically more spent on them than the children of the poor. And so, in fact, public education exacerbates the divide between the haves and the have-nots.
I'm going to ask you, before you go, there are some people who will spend their income to move into a neighborhood that's got good schools. And there are other people who already live there and don't invest the time and money on their children. Shouldn't people who are willing to make that investment, shouldn't their kids benefit? Or do you believe that it should be exactly equal all across the board?
I don't think it's a difference between equal and equality. So I'm not for equal, I'm for equality. There's a subtle difference, but it's actually not. It's a huge difference. I'm for making sure kids get what they need. And a child with special needs, it's going to cost more to educate them than a child who doesn't have special needs. A child who is, an English language learner who just moved here, from a war-torn country, is going to need extra support than my children will. And so for me, the goal is never equal, although that would be an improvement. Our goal is equality. So for one, to try and go back, for me, having a commitment at the national level. I always say a great defense, great military is our best defense, but a great educational system is our best offense in our country, and we don't see it that way. Our military is a national imperative. Our education thing is left up to 15,000 school districts. So that's one. Secondly, and that's an issue maybe more on the right, not always. This is an issue both on the left and the right. And I always say education should be the ultimate bipartisan, non-political issue. I think that's why you and I have had a good relationship. There's nothing for me, R or D or liberal conservative, about giving kids a chance in life and higher graduation rates and more students ready for college. But I think in education, talent matters tremendously. Great principals, great teachers change kids' lives. Roz Chetty did a huge study of hundreds of thousands of kids in New York City over a long time. And it's not about test scores, not about whatever. One good teacher in middle school, one good teacher raised the lifetime earnings of that class by $250,000. Higher graduation rates, less criminal activity, less teenage pregnancy, more going to college. That's one good teacher. Think about 3 good teachers in a row, and conversely, think about 3 bad teachers in a row. So our system of local controls, I traveled the country everywhere I went, 15,000 school systems. I always ask, show me one school system out of 15,000 that systematically identifies their best teachers and their best principals and places them in the schools for the children in the communities who need the most help. And nobody does that.
So I'm going to stop you. I apologize for doing this, but this is how we would be normally talking to each other. And that's the purpose of these Fridays with Frank. What about performance pay? If we want the best teachers, why don't we pay them more?
Well, there are a couple ways to think about this, and these are all controversial. And again, I get probably more pushback on the left on this one than I do from the right. So it's a couple things. I want to reward great talent for going where it needs to go. Be that inner city urban, be that in Appalachia, be that on a Native American reservation. And so I hate the term combat pay because I hate the war analogy, but for folks willing to take on the toughest assignments, we need to do that. Secondly, we compensate everybody the same. We need a lot more math and science teachers now than we do English teachers. And so where we have areas of critical need, there's no marketplace dynamics. So a combination of not just merit pay, but rewarding people for taking on hard assignments, and then rewarding people for going to those, in those subject areas where we need the greatest help. I think there's so much room for, again, getting a little technical here, but for hybrid roles. Great teachers, master teacher, mentor teachers, the best of the best, they should probably be teaching half the day and observing and helping the younger colleagues, in their classrooms every single day. We don't do that enough. So we throw these, very well-meaning, but just rookie teachers into these very tough situations, and they don't get the help and support they need. We just let them sink or swim on their own, and that makes no sense to me. And then the third one, I would say, Frank, and I would say this before the pandemic, but even more so, is we have to close the digital divide. We have to give every child access to technology, to hardware, to the internet, to Wi-Fi. It has to become as ubiquitous as electricity or running water. The idea that quote unquote learning can only happen in a physical school building, 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, 5 days a week, doesn't make any sense at all. Our children, anywhere they are, again, regardless of socioeconomic status, should be able to learn anything they want, anytime, anywhere. Here in Chicago, they've given out 100,000 devices. In Boston, they've given out 37. Good friend of mine is a superintendent in San Antonio, which is a very poor district. They have 49,000 kids. He's given out 47,000 devices. And we just have to, public-private partnerships, we just have to commit to giving children a chance to learn what they want, find their genius, find their passion. So those are my top 3.
And I want to endorse, because I know that there are members of Congress watching, I want to endorse the idea that if kids are on the wrong end of that digital divide, they are being punished right now because they have no choice. There is no face-to-face learning. And if they don't have access to broadband, then they're simply shut out. The question to you, is this something that the federal government has a responsibility to fund, or is this something that the state and localities should do?
All of the above, but I would start at the federal level. And there's something that folks in your call would know called E-rate that's funded through the FCC. We used a ton of that money to get computers into schools, and that was a really big deal. That was a major step at that time. But obviously today, having computers in schools is helpful, but it's insufficient. And so this should absolutely happen at the federal level, State and local are stepping up because, frankly, the federal level, there's nothing really positive or productive happening now. But this has to happen with the private sector as well, where people step up. And there's all kinds of creative stuff in South Bend, Indiana. It's one good to have the devices, but you have to have access to Wi-Fi. They're parking school buses that are Wi-Fi enabled in their poor communities to create hotspots. And there's so there's all kinds of interesting things happening. But we just have to decide, is this important or not? And for me, anything that rises to that level of importance, the federal government has to provide leadership, moral authority, and funding. And again, candidly, I see none of that today.
Well, I'm going to not only back you up through this conversation, but I'm planning to do polling over the next few days because I'm convinced that the American people want it, that they insist that every student at least have that equal access. And so I'm hoping that I'll be able to prove it over the next few days. I got one more generic question for you, and then we'll get specific. We're not first in math. We're not first in science. We're not first in reading. We're not fifth. We're not 10th. In some cases, we're 20th or 30th. What the hell? This is America. Why are we doing so badly on things that are so important?
Well, this is where I need your help and others. And this is some places where I've made some progress, some places where I didn't make nearly enough progress. And this is one of them. You say it's important. I say it's important. Everybody on the call would say it's important, but none of us vote based upon education. And I'll go back to what I said before, is that there's nothing left or right about increasing access to high quality early learning, increasing education opportunities, raising graduation rates, increasing college going and college completion rates. That's nation building stuff. No political party has a monopoly on that. But as you know much better than I, no one goes to the voting booth and holds their mayor, their governor, their congressman, our president accountable for improving educational opportunity. And I've never met a politician that's anti-education. They all love photo ops. They all love visiting schools and patting kids on the head. But very few of them are willing to put their reputation and literally their job on the line. And to be clear, Frank, I blame us as voters. I don't blame them. I'll never forget President Obama talking to the leader in South Korea and talked about different things and obviously fantastic educational progress. He said, "What's your biggest challenge?" He said, "The biggest challenge is that my parents are too demanding. That my youngest kids have to have access to English. It's costing me, hundreds of millions of dollars, whatever, to do that." We don't feel any of that pressure here in America. We're living on our glory days from 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And we're not out, we're being out educated. We're being out invested. We're being out innovated. And if we're going to keep, in a flat world, high skill, high wage jobs in our country, to your point, we are top 10 in nothing. And when I say those kinds of things, it's upsetting and people don't quite want to hear it, but it's the truth. And we should be absolutely ashamed of our educational performance. And I spent a lot of time with my colleagues from other countries and looking at what they're doing, because we're all, there's no competition really, we're all in this together. And just to see the commitment across political parties, across different times, that's what we don't have here. I worked for Mayor Daley here in Chicago. Everywhere he went, every speech, he said, we can't have a world-class city without a world-class school system. And we still have a long way to go, but the improvement's been remarkable. But you have to have, school systems can't do it by themselves. The business community, the philanthropic community, streets and sanitation, the police, the fire department, parks. He had the whole city working with us. That's the kind of leadership we need. And that is unfortunately highly, highly unusual.
And yet what's strange is I've been doing this now for about 9-10 weeks. You were the first person, so there's usually about 200 people on these calls. You got to 100 people before anybody else, before Tony Blair, before Mark Cuban, some well-known people. We had people signing up within moments of when they got the invitation, and you got the most of anybody. And yet, other than I see the Ready for Joe sign behind you, and that's very good product placement, it's just proof that there are Democrats and Republicans on here. But education matters to everybody. And I want to bring up communities and schools, because I know that you have supported that organization. I know that it matters to you. This is a decision that states and localities are making right now. Are they going to put the extra people in so the teachers get the help they need? The administrators, their attention can be towards the students that need it the most. And frankly, the students need somebody to talk to. My issue is still funding of programs like this. How do we convince people who don't have children that this is a worthy endeavor?
Well, again, you're much better on messaging than I am, but there are a couple. I always try and look at it from the head and the heart. If you look at what the dropout rate each year cost our nation in terms of lost productivity and lost taxes, that's a staggering number. If you look at jobs, high wage, high skill, middle class jobs that are moving other places because companies can do that because we don't have the educated workforce, that's devastating. It is in no one's interest that I'm aware of here in the United States to be being out-educated, out-innovated by other nations. The hard part of this is, and we can get into this, if nothing else, again, this has been a horrific time, and we can talk about it. It's honestly been one of the worst weeks of my life for a couple different reasons. But starting with the pandemic and then with the murder of George Floyd, if nothing else, our nation is being slapped in the face with the massive inequities in our country. And the idea that it's okay for entire groups of people, be they poor, be they immigrants, be they African American, to have less of everything, less education, less healthcare, less economic opportunity. The communities I work in now have been socially distanced long before that was a term. They've been socially distanced for decades. If nothing else, now appealing to people's heart and saying, how can we sleep well at night if our kid is taken care of, our family's taken care of, but our neighbor's kid isn't? And at some point in our country, we have to be more thoughtful, more strategic, smarter, and frankly, more compassionate. Groups like Communities in Schools, I'm so proud to be on the board of. They were an amazing partner for me when I was in Chicago, and they did things I needed. My population was 90% minority, 85% poverty. They got tens of thousands of children eyeglasses. I needed that. They needed that. They got lots of kids access to hearing exams. They do things, partnerships, fantastic nonprofits around the country. Again, I'm partial to CIS, and because they were so good to me, and I'm trying to help out. And they got an amazing young leader now. Bill Milliken's one of my heroes, the founder. But there's so many people who want to help that we have to give. Again, this goes back to your theme of equality. Every child doesn't need a community schools backing them. Every school doesn't need it, but a whole lot of them do. A whole lot of them do. And we have to create that army to support kids in communities who need that additional help.
And I do want to do a shout out to Elaine Wynn, because she's the one who introduced me to the organization. And between the two of them, it's had a tremendous impact. Okay.
She's a remarkable leader.
And I tried to figure out how to get into this, and the way that I'm going to get into this, which is the protests and the violence and Black Lives Matter and the disgraceful, despicable murders that have happened, not just in Minnesota, but across the country. And I want to do this with a shout out to Verbum Day, because I've got at least half of my students on. And guys, I just want you to be careful. And I want you to have the courage of your convictions and to speak out and to join these protests. But I want you to be safe. Arne, what do we say to the kids in these schools who are wondering about justice, who are wondering about fairness? And I don't know what to tell them, because I can empathize with them, but I don't feel it because I wasn't born this way. And I'm scared to death that they're going to get hurt. What do I tell them?
Well, I'll just tell you, this week, 2 nights ago, one of my staff was shot and killed. 2 of the young men I work with were killed in the past week, and 2 others, including a teenage girl, superstar, were shot, and those 2 are alive. So this epidemic of violence is not, it's worse now this week here in Chicago, much worse, but we've lived with this all my life. It's why I do the work I do now. I started to lose friends to gun violence when I was a teenager. So much I'm proud of with the Chicago Public Schools. I can talk about all kinds of things, better graduation rates. But Frank, on my watch, during my 7.5 years, on average, we had a child shot and killed every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks. And that was by far the hardest part of my job, was going to those funerals, meeting those families 99% of the time after they had just lost their child. My wife and I had 2 young kids at the time, going to classrooms where there was an empty desk and trying to make sense of the senseless. And I often say that we're motivated by our successes, but we're haunted by our failures. And I know we as adults fail to keep our kids safe, We can say that Black Lives Matter. It's important to say that. But of those who are killed here in Chicago every year, not just, we'll talk about the current situation in a moment, but every year, 97%, 98% of those are people of color, Black and brown. And I guarantee you, Frank, if more of those being killed looked like you and I, it would not be tolerated. But there is an acceptable loss of life of young people, and particularly young men of color, that has been true forever. The issue of police brutality is a really difficult one. We work with amazing police officers every single day, including today. We're doing emergency food distribution. We did 40,000 meals today. We've been doing 10,000 meals a day for the police. They're working double shifts. But there are parts of the police culture that are broken, and trust with the community in places like Chicago has been broken for a while, unless there's a willingness to talk about that and to open it up. I ask kids all the time, do they see the police as friends or foe? And most see them as foe. That's their reality. Before COVID hit, I'm always talking to different groups. I talked to the group of about 13 young leaders on the West Side. Again, these are anecdotes. In that one room of 12 or 13 leaders, 4 of them had family members killed by the police. 4 of them. So what happened in Minneapolis, we have seen in places like Chicago and many places for far too long. And our unwillingness as a country, whether it's on education or whether it's on justice and fairness and police community relations, our unwillingness to deal with really hard, really uncomfortable truths is devastating. And my question now for the country and for us, every moment passes. The question is whether we have the courage to do something very different now, to fundamentally address. And I'm all for protesting. I'm all for marching. I used to be all for statements. I'm tired of statements. I don't want to read any more statements from anyone else. But you know me, I want to see action. What are we fundamentally going to do to make our society more just, more fair? And I'm always hopeful, but I'm also trying to be a realist. I don't know today if we have the courage to fundamentally make the changes that need to change. And that's on us. To your students, I think honestly for you just to listen, to hear the pain, to hear the rage, to hear the anger, the conversations I'm having with my team and our young men here in Chicago and South and West Sides, they are searing, they are devastating. It breaks your heart. For them to see your emotion and just know that you care, that's really, really, really important. I'll say the final thing is you don't have to come with all the answers. In fact, I'd say you shouldn't. A big part of your job, my job, is to listen, to help create platforms for young people to lead us where they need to go. We as adults, I don't want to be too harsh, that we have screwed a lot of things up. When I talk to kids all the time, I apologize to them and say, it's not normal that you should know 10, 15, 20 people who have been killed. And that's the norm in every community I work with here in Chicago. That's not your fault. That's our fault. And we got to own that. And we got to do this work with unbelievable humility. We have to listen. The world is changing every day. Feels like a year now. We just have to work with young people, walk with them, learn from them, and help them lead us to where we haven't been because our generation hasn't done enough.
So I'm going to start to bring people into this conversation. David Brogg asked the question, is today's public education system having a negative impact on the younger generation's view of political events?
I don't know if I mean, there are lots of things we don't do enough of, and one of those things is civic education. And again, there's nothing, again, RD about any of this. I will say many young people are totally cynical. They're turned off by the political system. They don't think their vote matters. I would love to see us do something as a country where everyone who graduates at 18 gets a diploma and gets their voter registration card at the same time. There's lots of things that we could be doing to increase civil discourse. There are, again, other amazing nonprofits like Mikva Challenge and others that engage young people in the political process on both sides of the aisle and opens their eyes. But the level of distrust, the level of cynicism, I can't tell you how strong that is. And this is not just, this is across, racial lines, across geographic lines. And when people feel locked out of the process, then they're going to do other things that may be more destructive, to the community and to themselves. And bringing young people into the process, again, not just traditional lecturing them or the three branches of government, that's great. Giving them chances to be part of government, to intern, to talk to people, to visit places. They got to feel it. They got to touch it. It's got to be tangible for them. And are we doing enough of that? No, I don't think any of us are doing enough of that.
And I've got another question that's a perfect follow-on. General McChrystal is calling for public service for all young people, 18, 19 years old. Doesn't that unify us? Doesn't that bring us together if we have that common experience?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of his, and I'll tell you, Frank, I'm happy to talk education policy all day. I'm actually not spending much time thinking about these days. I'm worried for our democracy. I'm worried that our democracy is fraying at the edges, whether it's along racial lines, whether it's around, urban versus non-urban lines, whether it's along religious lines. I am fundamentally scared I don't quite feel like I have the luxury to be thinking about the nuances of education policy now. And we have to find ways to knit our country back together. And we did it today. We're worried about there's huge Black Latino tension on the west side of Chicago. We brought together a set of young men to talk. We had some pizza. I had some of my basketball buddies come and just break bread and start to see the common humanity. And we have to do that across the country. But for me, it's great to talk. I always want to communicate. I always want to hear and listen. But again, we have to act. And so now what we're going to try and do next weekend is have our Latino brothers from Little Village go into North Lawndale, the Black community, help us in rebuilding and try and do the verse, do one day Saturday, one day Sunday. I think working together is so hugely important. And as you know, if you don't grow up exposed to different backgrounds of racial religion, it's so easy now to separate ourselves, to divide as we get into our adult years. And so having national service, whether it's mandatory or not, but just making that available, making it ubiquitous, that anyone who wants to serve programs like City or programs like AmeriCorps, we have kids falling behind so much now, because of this, the virtual learning, isn't tight yet because kids don't have access to technology. I would love to see a massive, job market's tough. I would love to see a massive force of tutors, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tutors, young college grads, retirees. We know that helping kids catch up, and the best ways to do that is individualized instruction. So national service is a way to knit our country back together again, not to agree on every issue, but to see our common humanity, to fight for democracy. It's an idea that I think its time came a long time ago, but is more urgent now than ever before. And I would do whatever I could to support him in his efforts. And we've done some stuff in the past.
This question is from one of my favorite students, Jose Estrada. I'm sorry. This has never happened to me in public before. From Verbum Day, he asked me, and I'm going to bring it back to education, even though I am that concerned about the democracy, and I'm concerned for his fellow students. What is your opinion on Common Core standards? How do you measure them? And are they an effective representation of college preparedness?
So I'll try and these things get lost. So I'll try and walk it through very carefully. What you and I talked about earlier, Frank, was common standards, a way of measuring whether people are hitting something. And what we try to do is say, not some standards coming from Arne Duncan or Barack Obama from DC. We just wanted every major higher institution of public education in the states to say that if students are meeting these standards, that they don't have to take remedial classes. So in Texas, have the University of Texas certify that if students are hitting their bar, they don't take remedial classes. We all know college is far too expensive. We worry about loans. What we don't talk about, the dirty secret, is we spend between $7 and $9 billion, with a B, billion dollars each year for high school graduates to go to college and take remedial classes. That means they are burning through grants, burning through loans. Parents are paying money to take high school classes because they were not ready for college. That is fundamentally unfair. So I'd argue we need a high set of standards to do that. How you teach to those standards, it should be lots of flexibility there. And what works, again, in Illinois versus Mississippi versus in Montana, whatever it might be, there's lots of creativity, lots of different ways to do that. And we should allow that, but we should learn from it. What's working best what's working best where, and then how do we scale from that? And no one has a monopoly, again, on how to do that the best way, but we should be clear about what the goal is. I'm a basketball guy. The goal is to win games. There are lots of different coaching strategies. No one coach has it all figured out, but we do know who's successful. And that's the kind of thing we should do. So you have, a common set of standards, ideally, and a set of and ideally one assessment. We didn't get that far, but one assessment to see how folks are doing against those standards. Take it one more step. So on the common standards and assessments, I got a lot of pushback from the right, or I got a lot of pushback on the left, is saying that a piece, just a small piece of teachers' evaluations should be tied to student learning. And that was, for my friends on the left, that was a bridge too far. And I get the complexities, I get the difficulties, but for me, I always say the goal of teaching is not to teach, the goal is to have students learn. And we all have those amazing teachers who transformed our lives. For me, it was my high school English teacher, and she brought out things in me I didn't know I had and changed me forever. We also know those teachers that maybe weren't quite as interested in their craft and their profession or in us. And I think having some sense of whether teachers are actually contributing to students learning or not would make it a real profession. And this is not about gotcha. It's not about anything like that. It's just trying to recognize and reward that great talent that we talked about earlier. Whenever I'd go to California, there were 300,000 teachers in California. And I would always say that top 10%, that top 30,000, they're not just great teachers in America. Those are world-class teachers. They'd be good anywhere on the planet. That bottom 10%, that bottom 30,000 probably shouldn't be teaching, or should be thinking about doing something different. And Frank, there wasn't a single person in California who could tell me who was in that top 10% and who was in that bottom 10%. And again, if we truly cared about kids, we truly cared about moving great talent to our most underserved communities, we would have to have those difficult conversations. We have not had the courage to do that.
Well, I'm grateful. I'm really grateful for that English teacher who taught you. I don't know if she's still alive, but whatever she did a wonderful job. And thank God that she existed. Got a wonderful question from Sophia Dickens. And this is going to be something something about. Studies show that incorporated social emotional learning in Illinois raised test scores 11%. Are those programs still in place? And what can we do nationwide, more so now than ever, to improve kids' mental health during this crisis?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I want to make it bigger than that, and it goes back to community schools and others. So, and for me, it's honestly, it's not about test scores. That's one indicator, sometimes good, sometimes bad, whatever. For me, it's really trying to save kids' lives. So when I ran the public schools, Frank, we served tens of thousands of kids, not one meal a day, not 2 meals a day, but 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We had a couple thousand that we would very discreetly on Friday afternoon send them home with backpacks full of food because we worried about them not eating over the weekend and coming back Monday hungry. I grew up as my mother's inner city tutoring program. She always said, you can't learn if your stomach's grumbling. I mean, the kids would walk in, the first thing she did every single day was feed kids. And so now more than ever. I'm a weekly call on food distribution, and those schools are physically closed. School systems are still distributing tens of millions of meals every single day to children, to their families, and to the broader community. I said just our little, we did 40,000 meals today to the police and to the south and west sides. And so that is a desperate need. Social and emotional needs. The amount of trauma, the amount of fear that our kids are dealing with now, unfortunately, has probably never been higher in recent times. And something else you could check. You have kids that were already struggling before. You have kids where families were sort of okay and maybe living paycheck to paycheck, and now their entire world has been blown up. And that was COVID. And now you have this systemic racism that everybody is aware of now. Blacks living with it forever. Whites may be more aware, that they have been in the past for whatever reason. And so the amount of fear and trauma and stress, I can't overstate. And I'm talking to schools, districts all the time, how we have to take care of our staffs first, our teachers, our principals, our social workers, our counselors, but we have to be taking care of our kids in a way that we haven't. And this telehealth and checking on kids every single day and what's going on is important. And I'm always going to be the guy pushing for college and career ready standards and more kids going to college and all those things, a high bar, AP calculus, physics. But for me, the foundation for that house of high academic standards is that our kids are safe, that they're fed, and that they're free of fear, and that we're helping them heal and deal with their trauma. And if we don't do those things, then this other part, we're like speaking Greek. It's a different language. I'll never forget what I had a young man when I was at CPS. He drew me a picture. I kept it above my desk. It was him climbing up a ladder. And he wrote on it, his caption was, he said, "If I grow up, I want to be a fireman." And that is the reality. That was probably 15 years ago. That's the reality in so many communities, particularly for our young men of color. It's not when I grow up, if I grow up. And again, that's a big driver of what I do now, that we can't preach this long-term stuff if it's truly just day-to-day survival. And so, long answer to your question, but food, social and emotional needs, if we do those exquisitely well, then I'm going to have the highest of expectations for kids. If we don't do that, we can't get there. I'll give you one more example. After the Freddie Gray riots in Baltimore, there was one school there, Liberty Elementary, that the scores were off the charts. They were knocking it out of the park, scoring in the heart of the inner city, much higher than wealthier suburban areas. I'm always looking for outliers, good and bad. And I went to go visit that school a couple of weeks after. As a remarkable principal, Mr. Manco. And what he had done, again, wonderful teachers, all the things that you'd expect. But what he had started a few years ago was a food bank. And they were giving out like 9 tons of food every single month at that school. Now, that's not in any principal's job description. People could say, why are they doing that? And I can't prove to you that giving out 9 tons of food led to much better results for kids, but I know that it did. That's the kind of thinking that we have to help our kids, have a chance to really fulfill their academic and social potential.
So we're going to do college because that's a big issue, whether students should go back or not. But before we do, I want to read you a comment and get you to react to it. The damage done by not teaching civility, the young people who are in the streets without knowing how to protest, the young who become cops without knowing who their community is, who their communities are. All of these people have no foundation. No one has thought about ending racism. Could be a learned thing. That's from Richard Dreyfuss. And
Yeah.
He has been a leader in teaching of civics. I was on a call with Justice Sotomayor yesterday where they're going to really push it. I actually want to push you. Should that be a requirement that every student is required to take civics and every student is required to take American history without exception?
Yeah, so I think it's a little more complicated than that. So the half answer would be yes, but for me, we can't. This is not lecturing kids about civility. This is not lecturing kids on the history of American democracy, although they need to understand that in the birth of our country. Frank, we're not living these values as adults, and our kids might listen to what we say, but they watch what we do. I actually disagree. I think kids know exactly what they're doing. And this might hurt some people in the call. This is a new revolution. This is not the revolution of the civil rights era. It's a very different level of anger, of fear, of exhaustion, of frustration. They're saying, those battles were fought in the 60s, and guess what? We didn't win. We didn't win. Those tactics didn't work. So I'm never going to justify, violence, and the looting has been horrific here. And I spent Sunday night riding with the police, and it's a sight I never want to see again. But it's us again. It's us that's out of touch. It's us that aren't living these values, and we can talk about it, we can preach it, but we got to live it. And it's, this stuff existed long before President Trump. He didn't create any of this, but he has exacerbated all of this and brought out the worst of us, and brought out those that, where things went underground a little bit. Those people who love to hate and love the hatred and love to bully others, that's been brought to the fore. And so I would argue that those values are being lived. It's just it's absolutely the wrong values. And so the question is, are we collectively, again, throw politics out the window, are we collectively willing to live these values, lead, to have hard conversations, to not preach to kids, to not do whatever, but again, to walk with them, to listen to them, and let them lead us where we need to go. That for me is what's missing. So yes, teaching, but in a fundamentally different way, and as much listening, probably more listening than teaching.
So I'm getting killed by parents who join this call because they want to know, will their kids be able to go back, or should they go back? And I want to congratulate Jacob Adler, who I know is watching this right now. Wonderful young man who's going to go to Bates. But I'm going to tell you something honestly. I've been asking his father whether he should go if so many of the classes are going to be online, if you're not going to get that freshman experience. So my first question to you for college, do you expect them to open up, and should they open up? And secondly, if they're going to open up online, should they take a gap year and wait? And Jacob, pay attention because this is for you.
Yeah, well, this is for every child in America, family struggling with it. My daughter's a graduating senior, so we're having these conversations here. So there's no right or wrong. I'll say a couple things. I think many universities are going to try to open up, not all, but this is not opening up to what it was before. This is going to be a very, very different situation. I'll give you an example. If you had a class, let's just say Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings, you'll probably go to that class one day a week. And the other 2 days a week, you will do that class online, so that you'll have a third of the number of students in that class. You have universities that are starting school early and trying to end early in case there is a second wave, as we get into November and December. So for it to be safe to go back, for me, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I'm spending lots of time talking to these days. A couple things have to be in place. First, in that community, cases have to be decreasing. The numbers have to be going down. Secondly, there has to be surge capacity in those hospitals, and just doing an honest assessment. If people start to get sick, can they be taken care of? Third, and this is so important, there has to be testing, there has to be tracing, and there has to be an ability to isolate. And I don't know if the testing has to be every day or every 2 days, but it's not every 2 weeks. It's not every it's not every 3 weeks. That those gaps are too large. And again, the fact that as a nation, we have so abysmally failed at having testing and tracing and isolating is heartbreaking. And then the hard question that no one wants to talk about is not just how do you open, Frank, or if you open, and many will, not all, is when do you decide to close back down? And that's a hard question. Is that after one death? Is that after whatever? And then this is going to vary. If you're a child or a young person with some underlying conditions, maybe you can't afford to go back now and you need to stick to online. If you're a professor with some underlying conditions, you might not be able to stand in front of that classroom but do things online. And so I think the new reality is that everyone's teaching and learning is going to be much more so online than it was before. If we are smart, if we are disciplined, if we are testing and tracing and isolating, that gives us a chance. If we're not doing those things, we're going to see those numbers continue to spike. And the thing that's most tragic to me is we saw this tidal wave coming. We saw it coming. And had we as a nation had leadership, moral leadership, we would have shut down much, much earlier, stopped this thing, and students would not have had to leave school for so long. We wouldn't even be having this conversation now. We could have solved this. This is not just some out of control virus. This is a man-made disaster. And leadership matters. Good government matters. The lack of that has been absolutely devastating in the loss of life, in the destruction of our economy, in the uncertainty on the education side. It simply did not have to be that way. We saw this tidal wave coming, and we just sat there and pretended that it wouldn't hit us. And that's it's unconscionable to me. It's unconscionable.
So I've got one more on colleges and universities. You have been such a strong advocate for inclusion and for diversity, not just among students, but among faculty, among administrators. What about political inclusion and political diversity? Our campuses right now are pretty dominated by one ideology. Should we include that as part of our diversity standards? That's a question from Steve Emerson.
Yeah, I don't know how you do it for standards, but I think if we're not exposing ourselves to diversity of thought, diversity of opinions, diversity of backgrounds, beliefs in college, as I said earlier, Frank, it doesn't happen when we're adults. It doesn't happen. And so I think college has a unique, I don't even say, maybe responsibility to expose people to a set of things. And we talk about rebuilding democracy. I'm telling young people all the time, please, please, please get to know people who don't look like you, who come from different places, who believe different things, not with the idea of telling them how smart you are and how wrong they are, but just to listen and to build some trust and to build some understanding. And one of the things, obviously, one of the huge privileges, I spent time in inner cities, done that all my life. I had never been to Appalachia before. I'd never been on Native American reservations before. And if I thought things were tough on the south side and west side of Chicago, what I saw in McDowell County, West Virginia, and what I saw on Native American reservations, that's a whole different level of toughness. Our common humanity, the common needs are so huge there. And so colleges should expose, and again, all of us have to make, all of us, not just young people, all of us have to be a lot more comfortable or gain the skill of making ourselves uncomfortable. And it's so interesting to me, everything this day is built around our comfort, our social media feed, who we watch, everything we do just sort of reinforces and justifies where we are and who we are, and stretching ourselves, again, not to convince, not to prove how someone else is wrong, but just to learn and build some trust and understanding. You and I may disagree on some political stuff, maybe we do, maybe we don't, but I've learned a heck of a lot from you, and I've appreciated the friendship. And it's honestly, it's probably a little bit of an unlikely friendship, but those I value. I have a lot of friends that think the way I do. I need some people who are going to push me to think differently. When I'm learning from our young men on the streets, many of whom have done some horrific things, almost all have had horrific things happen to them. I'm learning not to judge. And it's been one of the most powerful and humbling lessons of my life. And so it's a long answer to your question, but yes, universities have a unique opportunity and maybe obligation to expose young people to a diversity of everything and trust their judgment to figure it out. But more importantly for me, build those relationships so that 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, when they're in Congress, there's a level of civility and a level of trust and a level of understanding where things can get done. And that, unfortunately, we have largely lost today.